Friedrich Nietzsche labeled them the perilous half of humanity. While contemporary discussions steer clear of his contentious views on women, Nietzsche's unfiltered observations push us to face uncomfortable realities that remain pertinent today. The thinker who proclaimed, "God is dead," also analyzed female psychology with a severity few acknowledge and even fewer discuss. Nietzsche wasn't interested in soothing falsehoods. He dedicated his life to dismantling facades to reveal what lay beneath. His examination of women arises not from animosity, but from his broader philosophical endeavor to uncover concealed truths. No matter how unsettling, his findings might startle, provoke, or compel you to reconsider long-held beliefs. In a world increasingly shaped by gender debates, Nietzsche's forbidden insights have never been more relevant or more perilous to explore. These aren't politically correct observations, but they may elucidate behavioral patterns that modern psychology struggles to address. Consider this. What if our contemporary understanding of female psychology is fundamentally incomplete because we've chosen comfort over truth? What if Nietzsche's most contentious insights expose aspects of human nature we've desperately tried to ignore? Nietzsche's philosophy demanded we confront reality unflinchingly. Today, we'll do precisely that. The will to power is the key to understanding Nietzsche on women. To grasp Nietzsche's perspective on female psychology, we must first understand his central concept: the will to power. For Nietzsche, this isn't merely about dominating others. It's the fundamental drive behind all human behavior, our need to control our environment and experience mastery. All living things seek above, all to discharge their strength, Nietzsche wrote. This discharge of power manifests differently based on one's position in life. Those with direct access to power express it openly. Those without such access develop alternative strategies to exercise power. Here lies Nietzsche's first contentious insight about women in his era. Denied direct access to traditional power structures, women developed sophisticated indirect methods of exercising their will to power. This wasn't a moral failing but a strategic adaptation to historical circumstances. In Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche writes, "Women are considered deep. Why? Because one can never discover any bottom to them. Women are not even shallow." This isn't mere misogyny. It's Nietzsche recognizing that women in his time had perfected the art of psychological complexity as a means of exercising power in a world that denied them direct authority. When direct force is unavailable, psychological manipulation becomes a necessary tool. Nietzsche doesn't condemn this. He simply observes it as a natural expression of the will to power under constrained circumstances. Throughout history, those denied overt power have always developed covert means of influence. For Nietzsche, this explained why women often appeared more psychologically adept than men at understanding hidden motivations and emotional subtexts. It wasn't innate, it was a developed skill born of necessity. When you can't change your environment through force, you learn to navigate it through psychological acuity. This perspective radically reframes female behavior not as inherently manipulative, but as strategically adaptive. The woman who seems to intuitively understand others' weaknesses isn't expressing a gender trait. She's wielding one of the few power tools historically available to her: the mask of beauty, appearance as power. Nietzsche's second forbidden insight concerns beauty, not as an aesthetic quality but as a power strategy. The magic and the most powerful effect of women is to speak the language of philosophers and affect at a distance, he writes in The Gay Science. For Nietzsche, female beauty represented not just physical attractiveness but a sophisticated form of the will to power. Beauty creates effects without direct action. It influences from afar. This action at a distance fascinated Nietzsche as a demonstration of power that required no physical force. In a world where women were denied political authority, economic independence, and social autonomy, beauty became a crucial alternate source of power. Nietzsche observed that women who cultivated beauty weren't merely conforming to male expectations. They were developing one of the few independent power bases available to them. Everything about woman is a riddle, Nietzsche writes, and everything about woman has one solution: pregnancy. While this statement appears reductive, Nietzsche's deeper point concerns reproductive power. In evolutionary terms, female selectivity in mating represents a profound form of power that shapes the species itself. Beauty, in this Nietzschean analysis, isn't vanity but strategy, a means of exercising selective pressure. The woman who appears beautiful gains the power of choice in a world that offers her few other choices. This isn't superficiality, but adaptation. Modern feminism often criticizes beauty standards as oppressive, but Nietzsche's analysis suggests something more complex. Beauty has historically functioned as both constraint and power source. The beauty that appears to make women objects of attention simultaneously makes them subjects with selective authority. This doesn't justify beauty standards or their historical burden on women. It simply recognizes that women have never been passive victims of such standards. They've also strategically employed them as tools of influence in systems that denied them other forms of power. The theater of emotions, performance as strategy. Women are much more personal than objective, Nietzsche wrote in Human, All Too Human. This observation introduces his third forbidden insight: the strategic use of emotional expression as a form of power. For Nietzsche, women's historical position required emotional intelligence and expressiveness not as natural traits but as developed skills. In a world where direct confrontation often proved dangerous, emotional expression offered an alternate channel of influence. Tears, joy, anger, all became tools in a sophisticated social strategy. Women want to serve, and in that find their fulfillment, Nietzsche claimed. Yet this service contained its own power dynamic. By positioning themselves as emotional centers of social groups, women could influence outcomes without appearing to seek control. This isn't about deception. It's about adaptation. When denied formal authority, humans naturally develop informal channels of influence. Emotional expressiveness became one such channel historically available to women. Nietzsche noted that this emotional acuity often made women more effective judges of character than men. Women have the intelligence of the instincts, he wrote, acknowledging that what appeared as intuition was actually a highly developed skill of reading subtle social cues, a skill honed through necessity. The modern tendency to view emotional intelligence as an inherently female trait misses Nietzsche's deeper insight. These aren't genetic predispositions but strategic adaptations to historical power limitations. When direct power is unavailable, indirect influence becomes essential. This perspective challenges both traditional and progressive views. Traditional views mistake adaptive strategies for inherent nature. Progressive views sometimes fail to recognize the sophisticated power dynamics within apparently disempowered positions. Truth versus utility. The pragmatic approach to reality. Nietzsche's fourth controversial insight addresses women's relationship with truth. From the beginning, nothing has been more alien, repugnant, and hostile to woman than truth. Her great art is the lie. Her highest concern is mere appearance and beauty, he wrote in Beyond Good and Evil. While this statement appears harshly misogynistic, Nietzsche's broader philosophical context suggests a more nuanced interpretation. Throughout his work, Nietzsche questioned whether truth should be humanity's highest value. He repeatedly suggested that life itself might require certain illusions, that untruth might sometimes serve life better than truth. In this context, Nietzsche isn't simply condemning women for dishonesty. He's observing that women in his era often demonstrated a pragmatic relationship with truth, valuing what works over what's objectively true. This pragmatism wasn't a moral failing, but a strategic necessity in a world that denied women direct power. Woman's love involves injustice and blindness against everything that she does not love, Nietzsche wrote. This selectivity, this willingness to arrange reality according to emotional priorities rather than objective criteria, represented for Nietzsche not weakness but an alternate approach to existence. For those denied access to systems of power, strict adherence to those systems' definitions of truth offers little advantage. Developing a flexible relationship with reality, emphasizing what serves one's interests over what authorities define as objectively true, becomes not dishonesty, but survival. This insight remains profoundly uncomfortable for both traditional and progressive thinkers. Traditionalists dislike the suggestion that truth itself might be subordinate to utility. Progressives resist the implication that historically disempowered groups might have developed strategic relationships with truth. Yet Nietzsche's observation extends beyond gender to all groups denied direct power. Throughout history, marginalized populations have often developed pragmatic rather than principled relationships with dominant systems of truth. Not because they lack moral character, but because principle is a luxury afforded primarily to the powerful. The contradiction of desire, wanting strength while appearing weak. The happiness of man is I will. The happiness of woman is he wills. This provocative statement from Thus Spoke Zarathustra introduces Nietzsche's fifth forbidden insight, the strategic value of appearing to want what one is expected to want. For Nietzsche, women in patriarchal societies faced a fundamental contradiction. Direct expression of desire risked punishment. Yet achieving one's desires remained necessary for fulfillment. This created a sophisticated strategy, the appearance of submission while maintaining hidden agency. In Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche writes, "What inspires respect for women, and often enough even fear, is her nature, which is more natural than man's, her genuine cunning beast of prey suppleness, the tiger's claw beneath the glove, the naive of her egoism, her uneducability and inner wildness." This passage reveals Nietzsche's recognition that beneath socially imposed docility existed an untamed will to power. The apparent acceptance of male dominance often masked a sophisticated strategy for achieving one's aims while avoiding direct confrontation. Man made woman out of what? Out of a rib of his God, of his ideal, Nietzsche observed. This ideal required women to appear as men wished them to be, creating a theatrical element in gender relations. The performance of conformity became itself a strategy, appearing to want what one is expected to want while pursuing one's actual desires through indirect means. This insight explains a phenomenon that confused many of Nietzsche's contemporaries. Women who appeared to enthusiastically embrace their own subordination while simultaneously exercising considerable influence within its constraints. This wasn't Stockholm Syndrome, but strategic adaptation. For those without direct power, appearing to embrace one's position while working within it to achieve one's aims represents not defeat, but tactical wisdom. The slave who appears content while plotting freedom. The courtier who appears loyal while advancing personal interests. These are not moral failings, but necessary adaptations to power imbalances. The domestication of man, relational power. man should be trained for war and woman for the recreation of the warrior, Nietzsche wrote in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. This statement appears to reduce women to mere comfort providers. But Nietzsche's sixth forbidden insight suggests something more complex: the power of domestication. Throughout history, political and economic power structures were dominated by men, but domestic spaces were often dominated by women. Nietzsche observed that this created an alternate power system where women's influence shaped the private sphere, that restored and maintained the men who operated in public spheres. Everything about woman has a solution. It is called pregnancy. Nietzsche wrote beyond the biological fact. This observation acknowledges reproductive power as a fundamental form of influence. The creation and shaping of the next generation represented a profound form of power historically controlled primarily by women. In Human, All Too Human, Nietzsche notes that mothers are readily inclined to use their authority over a child, to make him overcome his father. This observation addresses the sophisticated power dynamics within domestic spaces where formal authority might belong to men, but practical influence often belonged to women. This domestic power wasn't simply consolation for exclusion from public spheres. It represented an alternate system of influence that shaped society from its foundations. The hand that rocks the cradle shapes future warriors, leaders, and citizens, potentially a more profound influence than formal political power. Modern discourse often views domestic roles as inherently disempowered, but Nietzsche's analysis suggests a more complex reality: different spheres of influence with different types of power. The public sphere offered visible authority. The domestic sphere offered foundational influence on human development itself. This perspective challenges both traditional and progressive narratives. Traditional views often fail to recognize the sophisticated power dynamics within domestic spaces. Progressive views sometimes devalue historically female domains of influence in favor of historically male ones. The future woman, beyond historical constraints. Free as a bird above me, Nietzsche writes in The Gay Science, expressing admiration for unfettered female potential. Despite his criticisms of women as they existed in his cultural context, Nietzsche repeatedly hinted at possibilities beyond historical constraints. His insights on female psychology addressed women shaped by specific historical power limitations. As these limitations changed, Nietzsche anticipated corresponding changes in female behavior, not because female nature would change, but because adaptive strategies would respond to new environments. In Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche writes, "The weaker sex has in no previous age been treated with such respect by men as in ours, which proves that the traditional woman is nearing her end." This observation acknowledges the historical contingency of gender expressions rather than their biological inevitability. When Nietzsche declares that man is for woman a means, the end is always the child, he isn't reducing women to biological destiny, but observing a historical power reality. Reproduction represented one of the few domains where women exercised primary control. As other forms of power became available, he anticipated this emphasis would change. "Behold, I am neither a moral nor an immoral philosopher," Nietzsche wrote. His insights on female psychology weren't moral judgments, but observations of adaptive strategies in specific historical contexts. As contexts change, strategies naturally evolve. This perspective offers a way past both essentialist claims about innate gender traits and constructivist denials of biological influences. Nietzsche suggests something more nuanced: core human drives expressing themselves differently based on environmental constraints. The woman who appears manipulative in a world that denies her direct power might express her will to power differently given direct access to authority. The woman who emphasizes beauty as power might prioritize different strengths when alternative paths to influence become available. But we'll never understand these shifts if we refuse to acknowledge the adaptive strategies that existed under historical constraints. Denial doesn't lead to progress. Understanding does. The forbidden question: what now? Nietzsche's insights on female psychology raise a question few dare to ask. How do historically developed adaptive strategies persist even after their original causes have changed? If indirect power techniques developed under constraint, do they simply disappear when constraints diminish, or do they persist as cultural patterns? In Twilight of the Idols, Nietzsche writes, "When a woman has scholarly inclinations, there is usually something wrong with her sexually." While this statement appears simply sexist, Nietzsche's broader philosophy suggests a more complex interpretation. Historically, female strategies for exercising power developed primarily through relational rather than intellectual channels. The transition to new power expressions wouldn't occur without friction. This perspective raises uncomfortable questions. Do women today still employ indirect power strategies even with increasing access to direct authority? Do men still respond to these strategies despite intellectual commitments to equality? Do gender conflicts arise partly from the clash between evolving power dynamics and persistent historical adaptations? Nietzsche would likely observe that humans don't simply abandon successful strategies because circumstances change. Adaptive patterns that proved effective over generations continue influencing behavior even as their original causes fade. This creates tension between intellectual commitments to new paradigms and deeply ingrained behavioral patterns shaped by historical conditions. Are we ready to confront the full complexity of gender psychology without retreating to comfortable ideological positions? Can we acknowledge both historical constraints and the sophisticated adaptations they produced? Can we recognize that power has always flowed through multiple channels, not just the formal authorities recognized by historical records? Nietzsche's most dangerous insight might be this: true understanding requires us to look beyond both traditional gender essentialism and progressive gender constructivism to recognize the complex interplay between biological reality, historical constraints, and adaptive strategies that continue shaping gender dynamics today. But perhaps most dangerously, Nietzsche would ask, do we actually want truth on this matter? Or do we prefer comforting narratives that confirm our preferred worldview? Are we willing to peer beneath the surface of gender relations? Or would we rather maintain illusions that make coexistence more comfortable? These questions remain as forbidden today as Nietzsche's original insights. But for those brave enough to pursue understanding rather than ideological comfort, they offer pathways to wisdom that conventional thinking can never provide. As for Nietzsche himself, the philosopher died alone, mentally collapsed, cared for by women he had both criticized and admired. What final insights about female psychology might he have gleaned in those silent years of dependence? What unwritten observations died with him? We'll never know. But the questions he raised continue to challenge us if we dare to consider them. Do you dare?